We welcome our friends from CNET Roadshow back to the stage with Last Mile Solutions.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another panel on future transportation and current transportation issues. Thanks for joining us. I'm Tim Stevens. I'm editor-in-chief of CNS Roadshow. Let me introduce you to our esteemed group of panelists. On the front, we've got Brett Wheatley, who's Vice President of Mobility Marketing and Growth at Ford. In the middle, we've got Steve Vozar, who's Chief Technical Officer and co-founder at May Mobility. On my left, David Byron, who is Manager, Director, and Innovation Strategy at Sundberg Farrar. Would you mind explaining us a little bit about what Sundberg Farrar is doing in the last mile space and what you guys do in general in the mobility space?
Yeah, Sundberg Farrar is a product design firm here in the Metro Detroit area. We design everything from kitchen appliances to vehicles. So in the transportation world, we actually have decades of experience in mass transit, so train design. And over the last 10 years, we've moved down smaller into a lot of scooter and last mile mobility solutions, and even cars that can walk.
Great. And we had a really cool project at CES last week, which we're going to talk about in a little bit shortly. Yep. Steve, now I know you've got a car right over there, and others probably seen it in the wild. Can you tell us a little bit about what May Mobility is up to?
Sure. So May Mobility is a Ann Arbor-based startup. We're about 2 years old, and our goal really is to bring self-driving transportation to people in urban and residential environments to change the way they move around the places where they live and work. There's two basic arms to our business. We have the technology development side, so we're a full stack AV company, but we also have an operations team. So we're boots on the ground. We're the ones running all the operations. We're live in Detroit, Michigan. We've been there for about 6 months, about 2 miles away from here. We've done 30,000 rides on that route. And we've been in Columbus, Ohio for about a month and have a couple more launches planned for 2019.
That's awesome. And Brett, I'm guessing that everyone here has probably heard of Ford, but can you tell me about your role there and Ford's role in last mile issues and challenges?
Sure. So I'm part of the mobility group, and some of the things that I'm responsible for are city solutions. So we have a team that works with the cities, try to help the cities smarter, make them smarter, tying into our vehicles and making the whole ecosystem work better. Also working with Spin, the scooter company that we picked up a few months ago, and Transloc, which is a group that works with transit agencies and helping them to orchestrate their microtransit for the last mile solution.
Great. We're going to be talking a lot about scooters today. Can I ask you to define the last mile problem? What is the last mile problem for anybody who's not familiar with that term?
I think it's a real significant problem. A lot of people are looking at the transit agencies and how they've expanded to so many different areas, and I think a lot of cities, including Detroit, have really made some great gains in that area. But there's still pockets or neighborhoods that don't have a good solution of how to get to the bus or the train. They don't come to your front door. So how do you get to the bus or how do you get to the train if you don't have a personal vehicle? And a lot of different options. There's ride sharing, ride hailing, scooters, autonomous vehicles, a lot of great solutions out there and many more to come.
And that seems like a relatively minor issue, but why is it so vexing? Why is it still such a problem? David?
I think it really comes down to trying to understand the convenience matrix and paradigm and what convenience means to a consumer. So the consumer in their brain is going through this immediate calculation. Okay, it's this far, I have this option, it's going to cost me this much money, it's this much physical effort, summertime, I don't want to sweat. I mean, there's all these things going on in your brain, and so it's hard for companies to look at that and say, well, how do we put a monetized value on this lever or this lever or this lever that is being pulled in your brain as you go through? How do I get from A to B between these last little bits of distance from my main mode of transportation to my home? So it's been a confusing task for companies to say, well, how do we zero in on the person who's choosing to go faster or choosing to save money? And I think that has just been confusing and hard to hone in on the right solution.
And Steve, that must be doubly complicated in an area like Detroit or like Columbus where you're operating, where you have such a dynamic range of weather conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think one of the additional issues with sort of the last mile problem is it's actually really inefficient, right? If you think of rail as an artery and a bus as a vein, then you have to get out to the capillaries. And I think before big data, there was actually just no way to do this efficiently. If you wanted to go and drop people off, you had to pay a lot of money to do that. And it just wasn't an option for people who lived where there really wasn't transportation. So now you can start to see, well, I can maybe optimize this route. I have data, I know where people want to go if I have maybe a passenger manifest list in advance. But it's still really inefficient. And I think that's part of the problem is it costs so much. It's just a really hard thing to do.
Are we overthinking this? I mean, can't we just have people walk from the train station, Brett? What are some of the specific needs that we have to solve?
Well, first of all, unfortunately, not everybody is able to walk, so that's a real concern. I think you also have the weather conditions that are going to change. We've done a lot of studies with our AV team down in Miami, and when you ask people what are they comfortable walking, most people say about a quarter of a mile. But in a hot day in Miami, it's going to go a lot less than that. We're here next week. We've got 5 inches of snow. We're probably not going to have a lot of volunteers to walk a quarter of a mile then, too. So I think it really does vary, and it is a concern.
And it's compromise. Like, you're having to compromise something. And so someone, if they absolutely have to, will they walk a mile? Yeah, if you have to walk a mile, you will. If the, area you're in just doesn't allow it, but you need to go to work, you'll do it. Some people can't though, and then that's a real problem. But what you're asking someone is to compromise. And so then that begins that value equation of understanding, well, what am I not going to compromise?
I want to share an anecdote from our deployment in Columbus. We crossed the Scioto River. We basically go around in a loop. It's about a 1.5 mile loop. And originally, there's 4 points of interest, and it's sort of, they're basically tourist points, like the Science Museum, Veterans Memorial, a couple other points of interest. And we really thought that most of the traffic was going to be tourists who are just looking to explore what self-driving is all about. But on the very first day, we actually found out that there are people who view our service as a godsend because parking on one side is considered downtown, and it costs $100 more a month than parking on the other side of the river. And we're now crossing the river. And so people are doing that value calculation and saying they couldn't afford to park right near their work. So they were walking a mile across a bridge in icy, snowy weather, and they immediately, now our service is free in Columbus, so it's a no-brainer, but we can see that there's value being created there where there was no transportation before. So we can see that trade-off in action.
All right, so let's just go ahead and talk about scooters because you knew we were going to have to at some point. There's been so much noise about scooters this past year, but I know that you've got your fingers in some scooter plays there on the Ford side of things. What is what is the scooter solving for us? Why is scooter a good solution for this problem?
Well, it's interesting. Before we bought the company Spin, we did a lot of studies to see what was going on in the market. And if you look at probably the biggest disruptor in the last 10 years, it was Uber. And you looked at when they got to 10 million riders, and it took them about 3 years to do that. If you look at the leading scooter companies, they were able to get that number of riders in less than a year. Wow. So the customer acceptance is really, really high. Yeah. I think people like the convenience, very, very cost efficient, gives you a lot of flexibility. And for anybody who's ridden one, they're just fun. They're addictive, quite honestly. So we're very, very bullish on them. And we're also seeing a lot of heavy substitution for ride hailing and ride sharing. And some of these urban centers, it's so congested right now. You've got the Ubers and the Lyfts, and some of the studies we've done, people are saying that they're substituting rates as high as 35, 40%, getting out of the Ubers and Lyft and trying scooters, especially if they're a 2 or 3 mile destination.
There are also some challenges, David, from a design standpoint. What are scooters addressing, and maybe what are they missing at this point?
Right now, one of the problems is that they're developing clutter in a way. And so if you see all the scooters here around Detroit that get left, they're just cluttering the sidewalks. And there's a benefit that I can walk out of a building and it's immediately there. Whoa, there's a scooter here. I just turn on my app and I'm ready to go. But also, I've heard many people complaining about coming out of a crowded event and everybody's literally tripping over a pile of bird scooters. So it's definitely an issue to how to manage accessibility to them. Can we put them in the right place at the right time? If anybody's ever been over to China and seen the silver bikes with the orange wheels, I have literally seen piles of them on street corners, and that's great. They're very accessible, but it's kind of almost like an urban clutter issue, just looking at these piles of bikes waiting to get picked up. So that's definitely a big challenge.
And there's also an element of skill involved too in riding one of these things. I mean, there does require some amount of mobility, some amount of skill, and there's a little bit of risk involved too. I mean, we've certainly seen stories of crashes and injuries caused from these scooters too, which is maybe something that not everybody is willing to go for. So is autonomy then the answer? Are autonomous cars that can take you directly where you need to go the answer? Or is that just causing more congestion? Steve, is that what is the next solution maybe, or do we still need to go beyond that even?
Yeah, I mean, I think autonomy is a solution. When we think about scooters versus cars, we can hold a family of 5, whereas a scooter, it'd be really hard to do that and your groceries and whatever else you need. So we like to push people to take shared rides. And I think that one problem that you could see with autonomy is if everyone is going in their own vehicle, then you're just going to have congested streets. I mean, you can have the vehicles talk to one another, but if you're going to have shared streets with mixed traffic, with human-driven and autonomous vehicles, then you're going to have more congestion. So we also want to tackle the congestion problem, and it's not, autonomy is not a panacea. It's not going to solve everything overnight. I think that we need to have the infrastructure, we need to have the network to be able to group people in the right place. We need to have the social conventions to make it okay to stay in a car with strangers or to batch rides appropriately. But it is one tool in our tool belt, and I think that that's something that we're really excited to explore, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to launch and get out in the real world so as quickly as we could, because we're seeing these problems firsthand. We're getting people who don't know each other in the vehicle, and we're getting to experience that right now.
And David, there was a really cool concept from Hyundai last week that you worked on that it's probably a good time to talk about that would actually help to eliminate even the last few feet of the ride.
Yeah, so at CES last week, we debuted the Hyundai Elevate concept, and that was something Sunberg Farrar worked with the Hyundai Cradle division, which is a robotics incubator group. For 3 years, we worked on this project, and one of our slogans was that, okay, the industry is looking at last mile solutions, we're looking at the last 100 yards. And the idea is that this vehicle could drive to a disaster scene, imagine an earthquake or a tsunami with a ton of rubble. Well, vehicles currently, rescue vehicles, get to that location, but then the EMTs have to get out and crawl through the rubble to get to the person who needs rescue. So if you had a vehicle that could get up and walk, you could walk over the rubble and literally deliver the vehicle right to the person in need, pull out the stretcher, load them, and then the EMTs could immediately begin working on the person while the vehicle stays level and it walks over terrain to get back to the road and drive to safety. So a lot of people looked at the concept and said, oh, search and rescue, that makes total sense, but are there real world scenarios where this could make sense? And we said absolutely, because in a last mile solution, what good is an autonomous car that you can hail to someone who has a wheelchair and doesn't have an ADA ramp? They're sitting in their home and that autonomous vehicle is right there in their driveway and they can't get to it. So we said, well, what if this vehicle could just get up? What if it's just 3 feet it needs to climb up a couple steps? Maybe they live in like a brownstone situation, and it could level itself, roll the wheelchair right out, and the vehicle could crawl back to the road and continue driving. So really, just the last couple feet even is in need of solutions.
Yeah, and I love that the last couple feet are regardless of whether we're talking flat feet or vertical feet or any amount of rubble in between. It's pretty cool too. Brett, you mentioned before a lot of the work in Miami that Ford is doing when it comes to autonomy. And I know a lot of the research there has been not just on developing the technology, but also gauging people's reactions to those cars. Are people even willing to get into autonomous cars at this point, even if it does solve their last mile problem?
Oh, absolutely. I think the trust has gone way, way up in it. There's several examples now where they've engaged different communities and really getting their feedback. And I think there's also a lot that we're learning about the vehicles on different things like delivery of goods. When we deliver a pizza, how do you get somebody to actually approach that vehicle and what are they expecting? And we're learning a lot on how we design those interactions, not only people who are riding in the vehicles, but also on how you might interact in the goods delivery business. So.
And delivery is an interesting challenge, of course, because we're talking about another sort of last mile solution. And even in this case, is more about even that last 10 feet or that last 100 yards in terms of getting a delivery from an autonomous vehicle into that person's hands. Is delivery a solution to this problem instead of having people going to get an item, bringing the item to them? We're kind of turning the problem on the other hand. Is this a solution to last mile, perhaps?
I think it definitely is. We're doing some things in Europe right now. So a lot of the urban centers in Europe will not actually allow some of the larger vehicles into the city centers. So we're doing some things where you'd actually park a vehicle maybe a mile out of the urban center, and then you might have a courier, you might have a bike. In the future, you could have a drone or you could have a small robot that's doing the package delivery from that. So I think last mile definitely will apply in the goods delivery.
I agree. The delivery, if you just think about it's a density equation. If you have 10 people leaving their home to go out and get 10 objects, that's 10 some type of vehicle, autonomous car or scooter, out there occupying space. And if you could just have one vehicle getting closer to the last couple feet delivering it, yeah, you have freed up capacity on your roads.
But I will say that there is an expectation, right? If I order a pizza and I live in an apartment building, and I live on the 20th floor, I don't want to go down and even outside to pick it up. I mean, this is the status quo is that the guy comes to me. And I think that it's going to take a lot to change their hearts and minds. Maybe I don't have to tip the robot dog that gets it to my door, but I think there's an expectation of what the service level is, and if we can't hit that, then it's going to be really hard to overcome that barrier.
And we have seen some limited solutions to that problem. Robots within hotels, for example, that can make deliveries from the front desk up to your room directly, which is pretty nice and kind of creepy too. But we haven't really seen any kind of real-world applications on a broader scale, robots wandering the streets and going up and making deliveries yet, have we? I don't think I have seen anything like that. So I think drones are an interesting application, but then presumably you have to go up on the roof to get your product, which maybe isn't really any much better. So maybe that's a different sort of last mile problem. We can talk about that next year's panel. Let's move to the infrastructure side of things. And Steve, I think that's probably an area that you've had a lot of experience with. What are some of the fundamental issues in city design right now that are causing this problem or aggravating this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think that transportation, when you think about how much it costs to live in a certain area, I mean, you are going to pay a premium to live near, if you live in Chicago, near an L stop, near a good L stop. You're going to pay a premium to live where transportation is available. It even costs more to have a garage. And so what we see is these transportation deserts where there is no option. And this is what happens, I think. And then if your municipality decides to cut funding, then they're going to cut from the least used routes. And usually that's going to be the places where there's less economic activity there. And so the result is what happens is I heard a story maybe a couple years ago about a guy in Detroit who walked 4 hours to work every single day because there was no bus route. And people chipped in and gave him a car, and that's really nice.
I remember that story.
But I mean, the overarching problem is that this guy can't get to work, and there's probably a dozen more who won't walk 4 hours, and who's going to give them a car? And so I think that we need to do a better job in terms of infrastructure of figuring out where those population centers are and serving them to be an economic driver. And that's what I think that autonomous cars can potentially do, especially because the OpEx is just going to be a lot lower. People have asked me, okay, well, you do the last mile thing, why don't you just do it with a drivered car? And the answer is it's not economically viable. The only way that what we do works is if you don't have the operational expense of having a driver. And so that's sort of what the play we're going for, but it can't happen today with a drivered vehicle. And you've seen people try to do it, and those companies have gone under.
Is that really just a question of data about understanding patterns and behaviors to really begin to solve those issues? Is that something we can do now that maybe we couldn't have done 5 years ago?
I think data can really help us with that, but I think it also takes a concerted effort to say, this might not be the most logical place for a transit hub right now, but we see that this is lacking something, and we can purposefully build out housing around these areas and put these hubs there. We can make the last mile problem, maybe a last 200-meter problem, make it a lot easier. I mean, the guy who's walking 4 hours, it's not a last mile, it's a last 20 miles. So.
But of course, Ford's done a lot with the smart mobility programs in general. What sort of data, what sort of aggregation, what can you learn from this regard in terms of people's behavior? Is that something that Ford can bring, quote unquote, big data to the table to help solve this issue as well?
Yeah, data is so important, and there's different things we're working on right now with the smart vehicles and how we can actually interact with the smart cities. If you talk just about intersections, actually monitoring where there's heavy braking going on in certain areas that maybe the city could use to change where their intersections need additional stoplights, lowering the speed limits, maybe more dedicated bike lanes, scooter lanes, lanes for small and slower moving vehicles. So there's a lot of power in the data, and again, we're trying to partner with those cities right now and help them become a little bit smarter and share their data too.
And is there interest in cities to make those sort of fundamental changes to the layouts of their streets to enable this kind of thing?
The residents are asking for it. So when we engage with the cities, we usually bring a large group of residents in there, and so we have a nice two-way dialogue, and they're bringing those things to the table. And the cities want to make their cities more accessible too. So different things like even pickup and drop-off for some of the ride-hailing and ride-sharing, where you've got people double parking because you've got all kinds of random drop-offs. How can we help them figure out those zones that are appropriate to do that? Or as you mentioned, the scooter parking areas, how you can dedicate designated areas for that to make that a lot smarter.
David, yeah, go ahead.
I think one of the questions that comes up a lot is, well, what do I do with whatever device I'm using right now when I'm done with it? And it's this, do I store it for someone else to go pick up, and then you create a parking issue? And what you really want is to keep everything moving. You don't want things to actually ever sit waiting for someone else. You want immediacy. So when you get out of that shared vehicle, that zip car, that bird scooter, it's inefficient to have it stop at any point. So the goal would be to keep these things always circulating, always moving. So it's really then becomes a data, a communications, a commerce transaction that has to just keep that cycle spinning, because you don't want them to stop and wait for someone else. So how do we do that? How do we work with tech companies that are trying to connect all this information and keep the commerce running?
Exactly. Good
There's also got to be a big challenge on the municipality front of knowing what to go with. I mean, 2 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about scooters because they weren't really a thing. But now, I think a lot of people would like for their municipality to support scooter parking areas or something like that. But there's a risk that in 2 years, we won't be talking about scooters at all. Maybe we're talking about drones, right? So how do we create some momentum behind these things, or how do we create the idea that this is a new standard for transportation? Is that even possible these days? Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I don't quite know what to do about scooters. I'm annoyed when they are in my way, and I find them kind of an eyesore when they're just strewn about. But I don't think that it's also reasonable for cities. I think they've actually reacted quite quickly, to be honest. Within weeks of them being in a city, they're either corralled in a certain location or banned or something, but they don't want them to be littering the streets. And I think that it really, some cities are banning them, and I don't think that that's maybe the right solution, or putting quotas on them. I think you want to give people what they want, but also figure out a way to make people accountable for where they put them. And I think there's no accountability right now. I mean, I think you're supposed to take a picture of a bird when you leave it, but I've never heard of anyone being punished for that. So I think a combination of lockers or dedicated storage, if there was a place, I mean, it is kind of a fad. I have no idea where it's going to go. But at least if we can do something quickly to alleviate some of these problems, maybe it won't be a fad.
Brett, what about the things we've seen in Paris, for example, where they're banning pretty much all motorized vehicles on certain days of the week? Ultimately, you can see that phasing into something bigger. Is that really the solution of solving the last mile problem by not allowing any vehicle within the last mile and then forcing people to find other ways in?
I think it's an overreaction to the problem that we have now. The problem is so significant, that's an easy lever to pull to try and solve it. It's not going to solve it, but it's one of the things that you can start with. I think one of the important things is to actually work with the cities. A lot of the discussion that we're having on the scooters is companies that have just showed up without the city knowing they were going to be there the next day. What we try and do is take a very disciplined approach to start working with the cities initially to make sure that we have all of their needs in mind. And we're doing that on the college campuses too. Unless you really have that understanding of how it's going to work, where you're going to put these scooters, what the operation is going to be like, you're going to experience some of the problems that we've heard. I think one of the things that's also overlooked on the scooters, though, is that they can go into places where the shared mobility solutions like an Uber or Lyft may not go. There's certain neighborhoods where there may not be enough demand all the time to have people going to them. We're working with the cities, and Detroit is one of those, where we have an agreement. We'll make sure that we put these in neighborhoods where we can help people get to work who may not otherwise have options to get there. So I think there are a lot of positives that are yet to be untapped in many cities.
David, I saw you nodding. Any thoughts on the Paris situation?
I totally agree that it's an overreaction. And I love the idea of these scooters if I just think about it from a pure efficiency equation. And I saw someone with a rant online about the weight of a human being to the weight of an autonomous car. And one person, a 170-pound person in a 3,000-pound vehicle is just inefficient to move them 2 miles. Now, as soon as you ride share and you add more people, that equation gets better. But a 170-pound person being moved around by a 30-pound object is just great efficiency. It works, it makes sense. So I think there's a lot of good scooters out there. Gen Z is another one that's larger than the Bird, but it's being used all over small cities and campuses, and San Francisco has picked up Gen Z, and it's just a great electric scooter solution. So I think they are a great option. I think they're going to stick around in some capacity for a long time. I'm not sure that they're a fad. I think it's just they're introducing new challenges that have to be solved, and they will be. There's a lot of smart people working on them.
I think one interesting thing about scooters is, I mean, yeah, they're fun and they're efficient, but the times that you would not want to use them is also the times that you would want to have transportation the most. So I think we risk, if we say, oh, well, we're not going to run this bus because there are scooters available, then the day that it snows or that it thunderstorms, you're not going to have the capacity to actually move the people that need to be moved. I think that that's something to be really, really careful about. So you can't, but if you are running it, it's sunny all the time, and then you're just running empty buses. So I think that there's a really delicate balance of being able to have that sort of on-demand aspect. And I think, honestly, we might need to think about how to do balancing of what public transportation is available. And that's a data problem. That's absolutely a data problem. And then maybe an operational problem of how to mobilize that many things.
It's scaling. There has to be scaled options at different levels, individual, multi-person, mass transit. They have to all be available. And that's part of the problem is there's too many cities that don't have varied levels of scale. They have individual scale, and they have highways, and they might have a bus, and then if you look all the way up to airplanes. But you can't connect them all in a lot of cities, and that's our problem. So The ideal consumer experience is to have the choice to have any of those options. So I need to save money, I'll take the cheapest option. It's raining, I'll pay a little extra, get in a vehicle. I mean, that's really what we want to offer consumers, is that ideal experience, have the choice, and have them all work in concert.
Well, there's consumers, and then there's like public good, right? So I think we want to. So yes, some consumers can afford to pay more. If we're thinking about scooters as a solution for mobility in Flint or Detroit, that makes me uncomfortable because they can't afford to pay more. So what? They're just not going to go to work that day. I think we got to be really careful about that.
And also, in terms of that scaling, would we be seeing a situation maybe where, excuse me, where a given bus might only be running on certain days of the week, or maybe you'd get a notification that, hey, there's nobody who's demanding this bus service this afternoon, so therefore we're not going to run it? Would consumers actually be willing to be in that kind of a future? Or are we so ingrained in the idea that the bus runs every 8 minutes, and it has to run every 8 minutes?
It's an interesting psychology study. I saw some feedback from the train lines in Sacramento to San Francisco when I was doing some mass transit study once. And they said, well, we need to add a 10 p.m. line. And that way we could boost the evening, nightlife economy in Sacramento and back and forth to San Francisco if we add a 10 p.m. line. And so they added it, and no one wrote it. But what they didn't expect is that the rush hour usage increased. Now, why adding a 10 p.m. line boosted rush hour train usage? And it's a psychological play because people said to themselves, I'll forego my car and I'll take the train today just in case I might want to stay late and go to the show. I know that 10 p.m. train is going to be there and it's going to be available, so I'll take the train today. And they never actually then stayed and took the 10 o'clock train, but they started taking it for their commuting purposes because they knew they had an option later if they needed it. So it's that whole just-in-case mentality. I need it just in case, and I'll forego a certain mode of transportation if I have a thought in my head I might get stuck somewhere without an option out. And so that was an interesting psychology play, and so we need to look at that, providing things at the right time, but understanding human behavior and how we react to options.
Of course, the just-in-case mentality is a huge factor in American consumerism, as we see a variety of products out there on the show floor that do a lot more than most people need them to, like a truck that can tow 35,000 pounds and things like that, which is a beautiful thing, don't get me wrong. Brett, you mentioned the college campuses as being an interesting kind of case study in and of themselves. What sort of trends can we see from younger people in terms of mobility and their level of acceptance for things like a scooter versus a car? Are there any demographics we can point to? Because certainly when it comes to use of ride-sharing services versus car ownership, there's some pretty big trends based on age. Is there anything there in the last mile problem that we can point to as well?
Bikes is probably the biggest trend that we're seeing in college campuses where we've added scooters and there were bikes previously. We're seeing usage rates about 10 times scooters versus bikes. So I think there's a lot of substitution in that area, and I think we'll see a lot of that in the city environments too. But it's something we're going to have to watch very closely. I think a lot of the discussion that we're having says that there isn't just one solution for this problem, and I think that's so key. We're going to have another solutions that we'll be talking about next year, and I think customers are always going to want options. I want to walk today, I want to take a May vehicle tomorrow, maybe spin the next day. There's going to always be that type of flexibility, and it's vary by person, vary by city, and vary by the day.
We talked a lot about scooters. We haven't talked about bikes at all, actually. Why aren't bikes the solution?
Part of the solution. Yeah, I wouldn't say they're not part of the solution. Absolutely. I think bike ridership amongst urban areas is just really has grown a lot. So anytime I go to a company here in downtown, I see 8 bikes in their office lobby area for people that I don't know if you saw that 20 years ago. It was much more niche.
It definitely is becoming more widespread, which is great to see. But if you go to a place like Amsterdam, of course, being the prototypical environment, at that point, it doesn't really seem like there is much of a last mile problem because so many people take their bikes everywhere they go. And the city, of course, made radical changes, I think in the 60s, to facilitate bike ownership and safe bike ridership for kids and for adults. And that, of course, changed everything. Is that something, Steve, that we could look to do here in the U.S.?
I think it's actually hard in the U.S. to be a casual bicycle commuter. You kind of have to be hardcore. You got to get the gear. We live further apart from our offices and our places of business in general here than in Amsterdam, for example. And so you don't really see people like nicely going to work on their nice bike. Like you really have to have the right gear. And I think that Part of that is because they're fighting. They're fighting cars. They're fighting pedestrians. They're fighting for their right to exist. Whereas, if they had dedicated lanes or if they were protected a little bit more like they are in Amsterdam, or if they're just the norm is that everyone bikes, then they wouldn't have to be elbowing for room. So I think that they're very vulnerable road users. Probably one of the most vulnerable road users, even more than pedestrians, because they're going at a higher speed and they're going closer to higher speed traffic. So I think you really have to have the will to do it.
Yeah, level of danger for sure.
Yeah, a little bit.
And is there any possibility we could ever see the infrastructure changes here in the U.S. that we saw so broadly in the Netherlands to facilitate that on a broader scale?
Maybe on a city-by-city basis, ones that are really motivated. I mean, I definitely have seen some cities, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but that are really looking for separate, dedicated bike lanes.
Yeah, Portland, for example.
I've seen a call for people to do the Dutch car opening, which is where you open with your offhand, so you look behind you and you don't open your door into a bicyclist. So I think that there are calls for this, but on a broad scale, I don't know. It will be on a city-by-city basis. It'll be the culture of the city, really.
Are there any examples of the last mile solution in practice right now that are really working incredibly well? We've talked about scooters a lot. Is that really the best we've got right now beyond the existing solutions?
I'm going to throw out kind of a wild card here.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's great, but it's something that you might not think of, which is school buses. I mean, they drop you off. You pick up people at your house and drop you off exactly door to door, exactly where you need to go. The way that it works, you don't have big data, but you know exactly where they need to go. People are on a fixed schedule. There's no uncertainty, and I think they're operated at a huge loss. And that's why they're able to do it. But yeah, I think that is an interesting example of last mile, like kind of done right. And we've chosen as a society to say this is important that we get children from their doors to where they need to go in school, and we'll pay for it.
We've seen Volkswagen making some investments in something like kind of a premium school bus approach, which is kind of an interesting idea. Brett, do you think from a Ford standpoint, could that be a viable economic option, creating like a premium school bus for adults getting to work?
No, I think there's definitely some opportunity for that. When you look at some of the large municipalities, if they could take a $300,000 large bus off the road and replace it with some of these small premium buses that maybe the transit agency could own with much higher utilization ranges, I think that's definitely an opportunity.
David, what do you think it would get to take you or your friends to take a school bus-like vehicle to work? What sort of things would they be looking for?
Again, I think it comes back to it's not the service, it's the just-in-case situation. That I would avoid taking it because after work, I am not coming back on that service. So if I take it to work, great, it might have worked that day to commute there, but every Tuesday I go play hockey after work. Well, now that service doesn't work for me because I'm not going back home. So if I can connect it then with an autonomous option, or just right now I'd use Lyft to go, I can do that and I can make my way around. So once I start getting multiple options, sure, but I think a lot of people hesitate to even go down that mind path of like, can we all carpool together? Because we don't really all go there and back on the same path the same day. I mean, just think about busy American lives. It's like, oh, I got to go here, and then on Tuesday I got to pick my kid up here, and then on Wednesday, actually, I got to stop by the store on the way home. I don't want to not be able to stop by the store on the way home because my wife will kill me. So how do you answer for all these sporadic, spontaneous things that we are not willing to compromise? So go back to the compromise and the convenience equation.
Presumably there'd have to be some kind of a premium aspect to it as well, the ability to charge my smartphone in there while I'm going, or maybe a high-definition display that I can use for entertainment. Would those sort of things help to maybe appeal people or get them to the point where they'd say, this is such a nice experience that maybe I'll compromise my schedule a little bit to make this work?
Because you're giving them time, and everybody wants time. I mean, I grew up in the New York, New Jersey area, and almost everybody's dad commuted an hour and a half into the city. That was just normal. I mean, in Detroit, if you said, go commute an hour and a half, they would just like, I think you're crazy. But there, people live in bedroom suburbs in New Jersey that takes an hour and a half to get into the city, and they sleep, they read the paper, it's time, it's not that big of a deal, and it's a great last mile solution. Buses are fantastic when they work. I mean, everybody used to come down the bus out of the city and get dropped off, and you'd walk right into your neighborhood, and you'd walk a quarter mile. Like we said, what do people like to do? Walk a quarter mile. So it can be a good option. And where they've run more premium buses, they think they're very successful, and people love the experience of being able to have a little leisure time, get on my laptop, do something with my time. Driving is wasted time. Some people like it, and I love it. I'm an enthusiast. But there's days when I am not in that mode, and I want to do something else. I want to decompress. I want to catch up on something. So yeah, there's definitely options there.
Yeah, we've all had those days where we'd rather hit a button and just relax a little bit or get some work done. So work is what we talked about a lot. I mean, there are a lot of applications of the last mile problem, deliveries and picking up packages and getting kids home from school. But I think work is the fundamental one where a lot of us are thinking about, getting to work in the morning, getting home at the end of the day in an efficient way. Is telecommuting the solution? If anything, there's a big push toward telecommuting maybe 10 years ago, but if anything, it seems like it's kind of dwindling a bit. Is that still something that we could point to as a solution to this problem?
Honestly, I think that if cities were really serious about reducing congestion, they would have as many incentives as possible to encourage people to telecommute and companies to allow people to telecommute. If you don't have a person on, I mean, that's rush hour traffic. I mean, you can shift your commute, but it's rush hour traffic. It's twice a day. It's time that you could be going where no one else is going, like the grocery store during the day. I think that is maybe one of the smartest things that we could potentially do, although there's this huge stigma against telecommuting, even still.
Are there any municipalities that do that kind of thing? I've never seen anything like that where they're incentivizing telecommuting. That's actually seems like a great idea, though.
Yeah, I'm not up on the data to say whether it's waning or not. From my anecdotal circle of influence, it seems like it's increasing. I'm frequently running into friends and other businesses that allow their employees to work from home for 2 out of the 5 days. That's a big step, and that's a huge reduction in congestion. Just say 2 days a week. You don't have a meeting, and you got to get your work done, and it's all laptop-based work. So stay home. I keep hearing that more and more and more. So I think it is still on the rise.
Is there any trends within Ford when it comes to telecommuting or remote working? I know, Ford's doing some interesting things with virtual reality use and design and things like that, which would make maybe you a little bit less tied to the design studio. But in general, there still has to be a lot of face-to-face, though, right?
It's a reality that we have to deal with. We're a global company, so I worked in Shanghai, China for 3 years, and so you have to have those facilities that are set up to do that. So if you're asking somebody in Shanghai, China to call in at 9 o'clock, you don't want them in the office. You want them to basically be at home and join a quick call at 9 a.m. with Detroit.
Yeah, sure.
So we've given all of our employees the tools to be able to do that, and it's a necessity and it's a way of life.
So what sort of things can we look forward to in the next year for this last mile solution? Are there any startups that you guys are tracking that are doing really cool things that are about to hit the market? Anything cool that's coming up that we don't see right now, or is it going to be basically kind of a bit more of an evolution of the existing market that we see now?
I don't see any big sort of scooter type explosions coming up. I think we're going to see a little bit just more iteration on what exists, and hopefully, more autonomy, especially from May, but more, just common sense when it comes to scooters and regulations, and maybe some more harmony so that they're not in the way everywhere. But I think that if we can get to a place where there's people are okay with scooters and bikes and this mixed modality, I think that'll be a better place.
I think we're going to see a lot of growth in delivery. The delivery options and what can be delivered and how often and how soon is going to explode this year. And we're going to keep working on a car that can walk.
Walking cars. All right.
I also think you're going to see a lot more software that ties all these options together, where people can personalize the settings for themselves by the day of the week to figure out what's the best way for them. That'll really explode this next year.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the great things I've seen Ford working on as well, is trying to tie these things together, tying into municipal travel services, tying into your car's GPS, and ultimately allowing ride sharing as well and bringing that all together. And that's something that, again, talks back to the big data aspect of things, which is something, again, that we couldn't really do a couple of years ago, which is great to see. And I think that's pretty much it. I think we've had a really great conversation on last mile solutions. Thank you, guys. I look forward to seeing what's going to come up in the next year. And maybe we'll get some more scooter parking areas so they won't be scattered all around. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.